So we'll start with our motivation for spending time with these teachings by Aryadeva, reviewing chapter 6. And I've been listening to Geshe Tapke's teachings on this, and it struck me that everything that, how he explained that our bodies and minds and everything in samsara is in the nature of suffering. And so, not that we're always experiencing suffering, but everything will lead to that because it's in the nature of that, so it will arise. And yet even in that, so we have our problems, of course, and everyone's plagued, plagued with one thing or another. But luckily we've had the opportunity in this life to meet these fantastic teachings and teachers and make effort to understand our situation fully and generate really a sense of trust in the teachings and the teachers and the Buddha. And so we have really the best of friends in the Buddha Dharma. So let's take the time to turn our minds towards these teachings with a wish to be able to slowly integrate them into our lives and be able to be of greater benefit to everyone we meet, and then eventually develop a real heartfelt and spontaneous bodhicitta motivation. And so may all beings benefit by our activity tonight, and may this little effort that we make tonight stay with us until full awakening. So last week we had a really nice review about chapter 5, which is about the bodhisattva deeds. And this week, the chapter 6 is the main title of this, is to abandon afflictions. And that's because, what they say, how they label this chapter is explaining the means to abandon the afflictions that prevent the bodhisattva deeds. So basically, we have this beautiful aspiration to become a Buddha and to perfect ourselves, but what gets in the way? And so that's what this chapter is about, the mental afflictions. Especially it goes into the three poisons of ignorance, anger, and clinging attachment. And so when we have these in our mind won't cooperate, and we really can't put our motivation and our aspirations into practice. So this chapter is both to help us to be able to abandon the afflictions, and also they're the source of all of our suffering. In fact, the source of all the trouble lies in being in cyclic existence. So we need to free ourselves from that, and that's due to these contaminated actions, or the unwholesome actions that we do, and those come around based on the afflictions in our mind. So this is verse 126 through 150 in this chapter. In the first verse, I'm going to, these teachings went over about 6 teachings from starting on September 5th. And so I'm leaving some verses out and just talking about some verses without reading the verses. So the first verse, 126, is a verse that's about refuting that polluted karma and afflictions were eliminated by tormenting the body with ascetic practices. And this was a belief in ancient India. They had many, in the time of the Buddha, there were many different seekers who were trying to be liberated from the problems of cyclic existence. I think they didn't have any trouble identifying the sufferings. But there was this belief that you could do ascetic practices and rid yourself of them. And basically the Buddha was saying, no, that's not the case at all. Tormenting the body, you still have afflictions when you do that. And so he said the real ascetic is a person who overcomes their negative karma and their afflictions. And that wasn't really what was happening. That's not what other people were doing or believing. So But the Buddha did, Venerable mentioned 12, although I've also read that there are 13 of these Dhutanga ascetic practices. And these were practices that the Buddha prescribed for people who had too much desire. And so Venerable, went into a long explanation of how, and it's in these verses here, about how you have to treat people differently, because people who have a lot of anger versus a lot of desire, they have really different needs in order to work with these afflictions. So these ascetic practices were for those who had desire. And so what Venerable really was pointing to here and saying is, she said, don't compare yourself to other Dharma students. And it's especially how a teacher handles them, because everyone's different, so they're going to all be handled differently. And she also went on to say that even in a monastery we have policies, but we also have exceptions, because things aren't dogmatic. And so she said it's really not helpful to look around and see how other people are being treated and comparing yourself, because that's not really relevant. And she said, she pointed out, as she always does, how our self-centeredness gets into that activity, because when we do compare ourselves to others, we usually think that we're getting the short end of the deal, and then we'll whine about it. So, and I kind of thought, yeah, that's kind of usually how it goes, So she's pointing out the obvious. So those were the salient things from that verse. The next verse, verse 127, is the way to abandon the mental afflictions. And this one talks about the functions of the three poisons, that we need to understand how they function in our mind. And so the verse says, desire's activity is acquisition, and anger's activity is conflict. As wind is to all the elements, confusion's activity is nurture. So basically, desire's activity is acquisition. That's what it's doing. It's always wanting, wanting, wanting. Anger's activity is conflict, and that's was a little different from how we often think about it. We often think that anger's activity is to want to get away from things. But she was saying, it's not only like a pushing away. It's conflict with the environment, with people. We're not able to abide peacefully. We don't like this, we don't like that, we're complaining, we're in conflict with anything and everything. And we can be. So we have that potential in our mind. So that's the function of anger, is to be in conflict. And then this part in the verse about as wind is to all the elements, confusion's activity is nurture. And so this is the idea in when they talk about the elements in the body, that the wind increases the function of the other elements in your body. And similarly, confusion or ignorance nurtures these other two afflictions of anger and ignorance. And then she went on to explain that there's two main kinds of ignorance that we have, and one is ignorance about the nature of reality. What's the nature of reality? And so that's a kind of ignorance where we grasp at things to be truly existent. And then there's another kind of ignorance that has to do with karma, what's wholesome and unwholesome. And so those are the two main kinds of ignorance that we have. And then she went on and talked about the antidotes to these. And so you can see how confusion kind of, nurtures anger or nurtures desire. For desire, the antidote that was talked about in this particular verse that she went into was to look at the negative or repulsive aspect, or the disadvantage of, say something that you're desiring. So try to see the disadvantage of it, because usually that mind's exaggerating the positive qualities. And so that's one way to work with it, or actually even two ways there. Also, you can refrain from being near these things that you're desiring, so you don't have contact with them. And then also, she talked about realizing that you can't really overcome desire by acquisition. So, desire's function is to to acquire things. And our desire is endless. So by acquiring more things, you're never going to satisfy your desires. If that was the case, we wouldn't have shopping malls. You would have gone there, gotten your toy, and you'd be satisfied, and you would go home, and that'd be end. But it's endless, and so we have shopping malls all over the planet. So it's endless. And anger, for that, again, it's helpful to see what the disadvantages of anger are, and try to, within the situation of a particular, that's coming up in the mind, try to accept really what is, because oftentimes we're in conflict with what is. And of course we want to try to cultivate our love and our patience, our fortitude. It's also important to, this is the verse where they were talking still about, how you work differently with people with desire and people with anger. And the ones with desire, you were more like putting them into the ascetic practices or, that kind of thing. But the ones with anger, you had to do things that kind of, that you like, to take the edge off. Because if your anger gets too intense, you can't really work with your mind. So she was talking about, do things that take the edge off it and be kind to yourself. Don't be denying yourself or berating yourself, having this punishing attitude, because it really doesn't help. And so then, just like the verse talked about, anger can't be stopped by conflict. Dropping bombs on people just doesn't create peace. It just makes more enemies. So both of those have that thing where, desire's activity is acquisition, and acquisition doesn't solve it. Anger's activity is conflict. Conflict doesn't solve anger. And then for confusion, the antidote she talked about first off was meditating on dependent arising. And that comes up in a big way in this text. And so she also was saying that you can't just shut down and tune out and disregard things and become indifferent. Confusion won't go away with that. You're actually just kind of, at the best, you're setting it aside, but it's going to come back. So for all of these afflictions, wisdom is the antidote. They can all be overcome by wisdom, knowing how things exist, and differentiating the causes of what leads to suffering and what leads to happiness, which are basically the two, that's the wisdom that goes against the two kinds of ignorances that she already described. So the wisdom that understands the nature of reality, and the wisdom that understands what to abandon and what to adopt, because you understand what leads to suffering and what leads to happiness. So then the next verse, 128, the reason for the need to eliminate the three poisons. And this is where Joe Blow is like, well, okay, there's these antidotes to these three poisons, but why should one get rid of them? Because attachment feels good, it makes me happy, and for anger it protects me, and confusion, well, I just can tune it out when it gets too much, so what's the problem here? That's kind of his line, or his qualm. And so the verse says, because they produce suffering. Desire is painful because of not getting. Anger is painful through lack of might. And confusion through not understanding. And because of this, they are not recognized. So desire, so all of these parts they explain in this commentary. Desire is suffering not to get what you want. Your mind isn't happy. You're not satisfied. And anger, we're miserable. And then the part in here about lacking power, that was explained as we're lacking the might or the power to get our way, or to control the environment, or to crush what's ever in our way, or whatever's in the way of what is causing our anger. We actually we don't have the power to actually alleviate that. And so we think someone's blocking our way to happiness, and then our mind makes up a lot of stories about why that's happening, and then we just get even more miserable. So that's kind of a spiral down. And confusion makes us miserable because we don't understand things, and we don't understand like maybe the subtle aspects of the Dharma or any different matters, but we also don't understand people and why they say and do what they do. And she went into an explanation here that was kind of interesting. I think this was really for us, where we're often, because we're so externally driven, we want to understand why something is happening. And, understanding like the external world is going to help to alleviate our confusion and our pain. And she said, you can keep asking these questions why forever. This was kind of the meaning of it. But it's never really going to, it just is going to keep your focus to the outside. And the need here is to understand, why am I angry? Why am I having these responses? That's the real thing. Why am I responding in this way? Because we actually already know why people are angry. They're not happy. People aren't angry if they're happy. So, we don't need to have a lot more information than that, was what she's saying. And you can search forever, and spend a lot of time doing that, but she's saying, really trying to bring it back in, that, the real question is, why am I responding this way? And that's what we can work with. And this gets into another part where the commentary from Gyaltsabje was saying the inability to recognize these forms of suffering when one is overwhelmed by desire or anger or so forth is a great suffering indeed. And this is really, they're saying here, this is the biggest suffering of all, that we don't recognize our own suffering that's due to our own desire, our own anger, our own confusion. So we're constantly focusing on the outside. And here she talked about giving away our power. And what is the power that we're giving away when we focus so much on the outside? Is we're giving away our power to transform our mind, because we think we can't be happy until something in the external world changes. And then someone here asked a really good question about, well, how is it that you're giving away your power to the other person when you get angry? How is it when I get angry at something that's happening with another person, how is it I'm giving away my power then? And she says, because what you've done is, because you're saying, by what you do, you have the power to make me angry. And when you do that, I have no choice but to be angry. And so that's what we're kind of doing to ourselves there. We're actually limiting ourselves, we're just, they do this, I do this, they do this, I do this, like it's A leads to B. And you're making yourself powerless there, like you have no choice. Because you've already said to yourself, if they do this, I get angry. And so, you will never be able to be peaceful then. And that's in the way, we're not taking hold of our own ability to transform our mind then. And then she went into a little different twist on this, is how we manipulate others by our emotions. So we can have different moods, whatever it is, and we can give off this energy, or even in words like, I'm unhappy and it's your fault, is basically what it came down to. So that was like pointing out something for us to be aware of, is how when we are in afflictions, our mind is diluted, and then it gets really kind of screwy from there. It doesn't help to, you can't see things clearly. So yeah, we are manipulating people sometimes. So then she went on to explain, which I think is really helpful, is when somebody else is unhappy and they're unhappy with us, what do we do then? She said, really, you have to see if you yourself are coming from an honest position. Are you coming from a neutral or a good motivation? I mean, because, if we stay focused on the outside, they're unhappy with me, then and you're reacting to that, then that's this thing about giving away your power. What you need to do is look at your own mind, well, what was my motivation here? Was I just out to harm this person? Was it neutral? Was I trying to help? Where were you coming from? Because that's really what matters. And so we are responsible for ourselves in that way, and it's not our fault if somebody else is unhappy. This doesn't mean that we don't try to intervene or whatever, but just you have to start from a place of looking at your own mind. So I thought those were really good points. Okay, and then the next verse, 129, she talked about the antidotes to anger and desire must be applied individually. And the question that Joe Blow asked was, do anger and desire occur together the way confusion occurs with both of them? And basically the thing is they're different. The thing that's happening with anger is holding let's start with desire. It's holding an object to be exaggerating its good qualities. It's seeing it as attractive when it isn't, or it's exaggerating the qualities that are the good qualities that are there. And anger is doing the exact opposite. So their objects, their way of apprehending as well as the objects are both different. So they have to be treated differently. So you can't use the same temporary antidote for anger that you use for desire. They have to have different antidotes. And even in your mind, you can't have both of them happening at once. It's just like you can't have love and hate in your mind at the same moment. You can maybe go back and forth between different things, but you can't have both at the same time. So that was the point that she went into in that verse. So then the text in many of these verses then go into, well, how do you work with anger and how do you work with desire? And we won't be able to go through all of them tonight, but the next one is about how to treat students who have desire and anger. And this one came up a few times, but I'm only going to talk about it with this verse. So basically we all have these three poisons. There's no one who doesn't. But what it is sometimes people have more of a preponderance of one of the three. They'll have a tendency to have desire a lot, or anger a lot, or ignorance a lot. And even in one person, those things might change as the years go. We had a discussion about that when she gave this teaching, and she had said that in her life earlier, anger was the main thing that she worked with, and now it's a little more attachment, she thinks. She's got the anger more worked out. So what Aryadeva says is desire should be driven like a slave because severity is its cure, and anger looked upon as a lord because indulgence, which she translated as kindness, is its cure. So basically, by understanding how anger and desire, what their characteristics are and how they function, then a teacher will help students in different ways depending on which of these they have. And so she explained a lot. She didn't really ever use the word like slave. She just said when people have a lot of desire, make them work really hard. And basically she talked a lot about being firm with them. I think that's the word. They say severe, but her word really was more firm. She did use the word severe, but it seemed like she was saying more, you need to be firm because you have to see your mind has a lot of desire and it's making you create negative karma, and that makes your mind unhappy. And she said, keep them busy long enough that they can kind of work this out and figure it out, that what's making me miserable is the desire. And she said, don't pamper those that have attachment. And then she talked about people who deal with anger a lot, bad-tempered, extremely difficult to get along with. She said, be very kind to them and don't make them work as hard because they're already brittle and will break. And I can see that experience because anger is what I deal with, and your mind is so much more tight. It gets really tight when it's angry, and it's draining. It's completely draining. And so her words were that they can't endure much. They're going to crack. And so you can feel that in your mind. It's not a malleable mind, It's just, So, you have to set limits, but you have to be kind and don't push them like you do the people who have desire. And then when I read these, I thought, well, this is from working with us for the last number of years. Her experience, I think, in working with us, she's learned that be aware that although it's let's see, how did she say that? The person who's angry, it's hard for them to actually recognize that you're trying to be kind with them because they're angry. They can't take it in. And it's hard to please a person who's angry. So don't expect that you're going to feel like you've, ever pleased them. They're just angry. So that's not ever going to be your experience in working with them, at least in those moments. And what you want to do is treat them kindly so that they can be as happy as they can be. And then that allows them to have some space in their mind. This really, really fits to me. Like, the mind is so tight, you need more space so that you can kind of work with it. And then when you have more space, then you can start working with your anger. And she says it's impossible to please them because they're always angry at one thing or another. And then she said sometimes the kindest thing to do is to challenge people, to intervene and say, you can do better than that. So I thought that was a good, I've said that to myself before. And I've actually told Venerable, sometimes when I've kind of really screwed up, I've just said, yeah, this was not good, and I can do better than this. And yeah, it's a good, that gets you on a better road. Okay, now let's see. I think we're going to skip that verse. Go on to... Okay, so we'll go to verse 133 because we've talked a bit about anger. So 133 is about having understood the difference regarding the causes and conditions that make desire arise. Then we should abandon desire. And so here again, Venerable said that for all of these afflictions, we have to understand their causes, understand the conditions, the functions, what's happening when it's in our mind. What does it do when our mind is filled with anger or desire? And what are the kind of things it's related to? And then what is the effect of letting these things run rampant in your mind? And so she was saying, you need to take this to the cushion and you need to think about your life and identify these things. The verse says, desire arises from causes and also arises through circumstances. Through circumstance. Desire arising through circumstance is easy to deal with, but not the other. And this was the basic idea that sometimes we're around things and we just kind of, the contact, boom, something comes up. And those are a little easier to deal with, those kind of situations, because you can just avoid the object. So then, if you're, she says, if you're overweight, don't go to an ice cream shop, basically avoid contact if you have desire for things. But the kind that is from a cause, this is from cause of a similar type, it means you have a lot of habituation, a lot of familiarity. That one is much more difficult because you have like the seeds of it that are well nurtured, and it doesn't take much for those to get, sparked. So we can easily have attachment or any of these emotions come up when we have a lot of seeds for it. So that one is much harder. And I think they had this analogy there that was like the one with where it's from the circumstance. Like it says a bird can't fly without one of its wings. Well, right, can't fly. But the other one is to the kind of desire that a pigeon's instinctive desire. And you can see the difference there. Things that are more like on the level of instinct are going to be much harder to abandon. So what she was saying is that you have to be able to recognize that let me get this right. When you have to have enough space in the mind so that you can actually see these things arising and see how attachment is working inside of your mind, and then be able to actually take it far enough that you're eventually going to look at the deeper level of these things, of the kind of grasping at true existence that makes this happen. And so eventually you're going to have to get to the point of meditating on emptiness to get rid of this grasping at true existence. I think on a more, the level where we work at things more temporarily, like by, say, with desire, like looking at the negative aspects of something or the repulsiveness, like those kind of ways. This is where she gave some ideas, like what to do on the cushion. So basically, make some space in your mind from these things. Give your mind some space from, like right now I've been talking with somebody who's attracted to somebody and doesn't want to kind of go down that road because they're thinking about monastic life. So, being attracted to somebody is not really great. So, watching what's happening in the mind there, I think this person really is doing a very good job of really taking the time to see what's happening in the mind and identify things and then use the Dharma antidotes. But if you didn't give yourself the space and the time to do that, you would just kind of get pulled along by the desire. You have to make the space for these things and then ask, why am I so attached to these things? What's making it arise? How is this operating in my mind? What's the effect when I have this kind of attachment? How do I become blind? And then she talked about you could just get attached to about anything, an idea, religion, anything. I want. So, okay, and then we'll go to verse 135, recognizing the root of afflictions. And this is a verse that's very often quoted. It's a famous verse. And the question, finally Joe Blow asks a good question. He says, the different characteristics of desire and anger have been described, but what are the various characteristics of confusion? And the verse by Aryadeva is, as the tactile sense pervades the body, confusion is present in them all. By overcoming confusion, one will also overcome all disturbing emotions. And so this is the idea that the sense of, what I would say is somatosensory, knowing the various sensations of the body pervades all parts of the body. They say it like touch, but we have all these different kind of receptors almost in almost all of our body. There are some places that don't, but we have all kinds of receptors: pressure, pain, tactile, temperature, all these various kinds of receptors. They pervade the whole body. So, you can, every part of the body almost has those. And in the same way, so just as the tactile sense organ pervades all other sense organs, such as the eye, and acts as a basis without which none of the others could exist, confusion, which is a disturbing attitude of ignorance, misconceives dependent arising, free from inherent existence as truly existent. And this is similarly present in and pervades all the afflictions. So basically what it's saying here is that just as the tactile sense pervades the whole body, confusion pervades the afflictions. It's as simple as that. Does that make sense? And so basically we're misconceiving, distorting things. That's what confusion is doing. So what we have to do is understand the mode of apprehension that is happening with this, where we're grasping at true existence. And then we have to understand how that's present both in anger and present in a desire or attachment. So with desire, we're grasping at the object as being inherently attractive or pleasurable from its own side. It's just gorgeous, And with anger, we're grasping at object as being inherently undesirable. They're just a jerk, 100%, through and through, right? So, that's way distorted. So you have a lot of confusion going on there with both of those. And so in here she also spoke some about, we need to understand how this works in the big picture and how this takes us into cyclic existence. Because in the 12 links of dependent origination, which describes our situation of getting into and how to get out of cyclic existence, this condition we have of being born and born again with bodies and minds that are under the control of ignorance, afflictions, and our negative karma. In order to get out of this endless loop of birth after birth after birth, that's in the nature of suffering, we have to understand these 12 links. And the first link is this ignorance. The second is it leads to some kind of action. And what's in between there is the affliction. You know, you have the ignorance, it leads to these afflictions, and boom, you act and create karma. And those then lead like seeds in your mind stream, and you know, she didn't go into a lot of that, and we don't have time to do that, but basically that's the point to understand about this. And I think we talked about that already. Okay, and then she explained how there's a lot of discussion about this verse, and that there's different ways that it's generally explained. And one was kind of basically this idea of something happens serially. One thing leads to another, and that was so that the order is, how this kind of is functioning, is that there's this grasping at inherent existence, that leads to grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. So you have this ignorance that leads to grasping at like a way that you see yourself as existing as a person, which is, and then that leads to either attachment or anger. So it goes ignorance, there's a person here, there's the affliction. And they go 1, 2, 3, one leads to the other serially. But His Holiness explains it differently, and he explains it by bringing in the philosophical positions of the lower schools and the highest school, which is the Prasangika. And so basically what happens here is that the lower schools, when they talk about these 12 links, and what is it that binds us in cyclic existence, they say it's this grasping at the person as self-sufficient, substantially existent, the SSSE in your notes, so much easier. But the Prasangika don't agree with that. They say it's grasping at an inherently existent or a truly existent person. And so His Holiness says this indicates that because both of these things do exist, these kinds of grasping, he says this indicates that there's a gross and subtle kind of afflictions. And when you're grasping at the person as a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, which is this sense of a control, or like there's some boss inside there that's saying, I can do this, I can do that, I can make myself healthy, I can be, I can not get sick. There's somebody like controlling the show there. That's one way they describe it. So let's see. Okay, so afflictions arise due to grasping at that. That's a gross kind of level of affliction, versus it's more subtle, the kind of grasping that happens at an inherently existent person. And so then someone in the audience here has a really good question is, well, first they clarified what she was saying, like, well, what is he saying? Is he saying that this grasping of the true existence arises together with the gross desire? And it was different, because remember the first one went serially, 1, 2, 3, and this one is different. It's kind of all at once. And basically what His Holiness is saying, that there's a kind of subtle desire that grasps at true existence, and it's kind of incorporated within it. I think Venerable even put her hands like that when she did that. It's incorporated with it. So then the question went back, well, is that different from the distinction of the 3 modes of apprehension, which was these 3, first you're apprehending, you have this grasping that was the ignorance part, then it went into the grasping at the self-sufficient, substantially existent person, and then boom, you had the kind of grasping that led to the affliction. How is that different? And she said, well, yeah, it's very different, because first off, the one happens like serially, 1, 2, 3, right? And what they're saying is that what you're grasping at is this self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And so then the next question was, well, then what are the implications of this debate? So these actually the questions that we asked during that were really quite good, because the implications are huge. If you don't figure out what is the cause of being in cyclic existence, you can't get out. It's like as bad as the guys in the very first verse we started with, who thought that if you did ascetic practices and just made yourself have so much pain that you got, that was going to free you, or the guys that back in the time of the Buddha were jumping on tridents, And if they could get it to go up through their body and come out of their head, they'd be liberated. I mean, like, that's as bad as nowadays when people are wanted to, follow the comets and all those guys that killed themselves all at once and wore their tennis shoes the night when the comet went by, and they were, is that going to liberate you? So it's quite important here, because you have to figure out what is the root. What is it that's keeping you bound in cyclic existence? So that's why this is such an important verse, and why they get into these questions about it. So you have to, what she boiled it down to is you have to really identify what the object of negation is. What is it you're saying that doesn't exist? What are you saying that ignorance is holding on to that doesn't exist? So that's quite an important verse. Okay, and then verse 136 is recognizing the antidote that eliminates confusion. So another good question, what are the means to get rid of confusion, which is the root of futility? The root of futility, why does he say that? It's because it's futile to be going life after life after life in cyclic existence. That's an exercise in futility. So the verse is, when dependent arising is seen, confusion will not occur. Thus every effort has been made here to explain this precisely, to explain precisely this subject. And basically what he's, in the last part, he's saying, the rest of this book, the last 8 or 7 chapters is all about this, which we haven't gotten to yet. In the first part, when dependent arising is seen, confusion will not occur. So basically, once we can see, understand dependent arising deeply at all its levels, we won't have any confusion. Our ignorance will be abolished. And so this is where it starts getting into the topics of dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness, and emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. And she spent a lot of time on this. Now I have to decide how to manage the time. Okay, so we'll just skip those 2 pages and go forward here. Okay, so what ceases confusion is seeing dependent arising, because dependent arising is the exact opposite mode of existence from the mode of existence of how ignorance apprehends. Ignorance apprehends or grasps onto true existence, which is existence from its own side, which is like this objective, independent existence. Ignorance is misapprehending, and that's what it's grasping onto. And dependent arising is the total opposite of that. And this is very easy to say, but extremely hard to realize. And so then and how hard it is to realize is that most of the Buddhists, the lowest Buddhist schools actually don't see this at all. They see that, yeah, things are dependent arising, and they're also truly existent. Things that with the highest, the Prasangika view and even the Madhyamaka view, you see as things that are totally opposite. They see as being completely workable, and that's how different the view is and how subtle the view is. So it would go like this. The lowest schools would say, yeah, things are dependent arising, and they also exist objectively from their own side. Here's a striker, here's a gong, here's a cup. That's what it is from its own side. And the Prasangika Madhyamaka viewpoint would say, no, when you look at this through reasoning and when you're analyzing it, you'll never find the cup in this. You'll never find it in any of the parts. As you do this ultimate analysis, you'll never find it there. And that's, they really see that differently. And what you'll find, and this is really kind of like the core of how these statements of the meaning of dependent arising is emptiness, and the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. The core of how they get to some of this is understanding that inherent existence or independent existence and dependent arising are completely incompatible. That's the highest view. If it's something is inherently existent, it can't arise dependently. You can't be independent and dependent at the same time. It's got to be one or the other. So if something arises dependently, then it can't exist from its own side inherently. That's how you get into this. So it starts with emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. And so Venerable then, although she said, okay, they get into this in chapter 9 on, then she just launched into it. And so she brought out Lama Tsongkhapa's text, The Ocean of Reasoning, and she took the verses from that, which I'll read these because I'll shorten this, but I think even if we just with the root verses, without a lot of her explanation, we can get an idea of the points. And I want to mention that I did a lot of transcription of these 6 talks, and I'm happy to send them to you. So just send an email to office@Sravasti, office.sravasti@gmail.com. And I will send you this transcript. It's pretty much verbatim. If it's not verbatim, it's marked in brackets. So I typed all of this stuff out, and you can read through this. It's really fantastic because we worked on this with Jeffrey Hopkins for months, and then Venerable just went home, studied it, and then just distilled it and laid it all out for us in like 40 minutes. So between the few talks that she gave in here on emptiness, if you read those parts of these. Of this 50-some pages that I could send you, you'll get it because it's all there. Okay, so then she went into Tsongkhapa's Ocean of Reasoning, which is a commentary on Nagarjuna's treatise on the Middle Way. And it says, emptiness comes to mean dependent arising for Madhyamikas who have refuted inherent existence through a reliable cognizer, not for others. And this is where Jeffrey was trying to help us understand that emptiness comes to mean dependent arising. And that is only the case for Madhyamikas, for people who have this highest view, who have refuted inherent existence through a reliable cognizer. That means they have an inferential realization of emptiness. For them, this is the case. For other people, it's not. Because many people realize that things are dependent arising. I understand that if I plant a seed, it will grow a plant if I give it the right conditions, right? But I don't understand the emptiness of these things. So you have to have gotten yourself to the level of understanding where you have an inferential realization of emptiness for it to be true for you that emptiness comes to mean dependent arising. So I'll read the verse again. Emptiness comes to mean dependent arising for Madhyamikas who have refuted inherent existence through a reliable cognizer, not for others. And then it goes on, when Madhyamikas explicitly ascertain that external and internal things arise dependently, reliant on causes, then they ascertain the meaning of the emptiness of inherent existence through the force of that very awareness. And this is the idea that these people who have this understanding of emptiness, right, at that level, they ascertain external, internal things that are arising dependently. They see that they are reliant on causes, and through the force of that very awareness, without any more reasoning going on, they can see that they're a dependent arising. Let me see if I read that right. When Madhyamikas explicitly ascertain that external and internal things arise dependently. So actually I said that backwards. When they see the dependent arising, reliant on causes, then they ascertain the meaning of the emptiness of inherent existence through the force of that very awareness. So they have this awareness of dependent arising, and because they already have the awareness of emptiness, without doing any more reasoning, boom, they can see that this thing is empty through seeing that it's a dependent arising. Whereas me, I just see it's a seed and it's going to grow into a plant if I put water on it and take care of it. I don't see the emptiness of it, right? Okay, and why, then the question is, well, what does it take to have that first inferential realization of emptiness? And this is where we got lost with Jeffrey, and I don't think we came back fully, but Venerable went on, and she said, you need the syllogism. And she went on, the sprout is empty of true existence because it's a dependent arising. That's the syllogism. So it's not, if you just know that the sprout is a dependent arising, like I know that a sprout will grow if I give it all these things, it will grow into a plant. That doesn't mean you've realized emptiness, because you have to have these different modes or the different criteria for a valid syllogism. So one of them is that the reason has to apply to the subject. So that is, the sprout is a dependent arising, and that we already know. But then you also have to know the pervasion. If it's a dependent arising, it must be empty of true existence. And it's these people who have the realization of emptiness who understand that. And it's because back there in that other part, they get this thing, it's a dichotomy. Something that's independent can't be dependent. And they see that when it's independent, that's what inherent existence is. They're a jerk from their own side, inherently, through and through. Didn't have anything to do with any causes and conditions. They just are, And they, that's how you have to be able to see the parts. Okay. And for them, I can read this to you and I can type this thing out, but for me it's still intellectual. But for them it's not. They've actually been able to take it in. So they know that if it's a dependent arising, it's empty. And it has a huge impact on the mind. And I think I've said this right. But it'd be safer to read it. Okay, then it goes on through from Lama Tsongkhapa, through explicitly ascertaining that phenomena arise dependently. Those who have the correct view of reality, which is, we're talking now about those people who have this inferential, reliable cognizer, they've already realized emptiness. So let me read that again. Those who, through explicitly ascertaining that phenomena arise dependently, those who have the correct view of reality will immediately and explicitly ascertain their emptiness of true existence. And so that's kind of what we just explained. They don't need any further reasoning. They see the dependent arising. Boom.
But it's inferentially, right?
They have it.
The syllogisms.
They've used the syllogisms to get the inferential understanding of emptiness, and then through explicitly ascertaining that phenomena arise dependently, right? In that moment now, with that understanding already, they're seeing the dependency, and then boom, those who have the correct view of reality will immediately and explicitly ascertain their emptiness of true existence. So, let's see, by understanding that true existence implies independent existence, they know validly that independent existence and dependent arising are contradictory. That's how it works. That's how the mind is able to make this happen. Okay, I think that. And then she goes on to explain the reverse. Dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness. So now this is where, this is interesting. Before this she explained the three kinds of dependent arising. So you'll have to get the transcript because we don't have time. There's three. Dependent arising based on causes, dependent arising based on parts, and dependent arising based on term and concept. Okay, so then, when you've gotten to this point, you don't have a full understanding of dependent arising yet. You've used kind of like the lower levels to get your realization of emptiness. But until you have to fully understand dependent arising, let me say this more slowly, to fully understand dependence on designation by conceptuality, that third one, the kind of dependent arising that's based on term and concept, or you could say designated by conceptuality, one must understand emptiness. And so understanding the causal dependence and understanding the dependence on parts can help you to prove emptiness. Understanding dependence on term and concept is a reason to understand emptiness, but you don't fully understand that kind of dependent arising yet until after you've realized emptiness, and then you have to really have developed that. Let me go forward here because it will explain it. Through the force of explicitly understanding emptiness, the subtlest level of dependent arising is ascertained without the need for further reasons. And so the force of explicitly understanding emptiness through either direct or inferential, the subtlest level of dependent arising, this dependent on term and concept, is ascertained without the need of further reasoning. And that's the meaning of dependent arising being the meaning of emptiness. And so what I understood from that is that your level, when you first realize emptiness, it gets more and more profound. And so as that deepens, eventually you're going to be able to understand dependent arising fully. So does that make sense to some of you? Oh, just read the transcript. It'll be easier. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Let's pick one last verse that we can actually understand. Maybe we have to go to the end. The next ones were, I don't know what verse that was. We're in the mid-30s there, and it goes up to 150. Many of the next ones were about anger, and they were really helpful. Yeah, there was one thing in here that I thought was particularly helpful. Oh yeah, this is the thought that maybe I'm finally getting ready to take on. I'm using more, which I've had a hard time using. So we'll do verse 140. The inappropriateness of anger in circumstances that terminate the effects of misdeeds. So basically, it's really inappropriate for us to get angry in situations that are going to consume our negative karma. This would be so nice to be able to put into gear. If we could actually do this on a daily level to some degree, it would really help, because it's so powerful. So basically the verse says, he's saying it's foolish to get angry when one hears harsh words. And then the Aryadeva's verses are, it is said, unpleasant words end previously done ill deeds. The ignorant and unwise do not want to purify themselves. So basically, when we hear unpleasant words, we usually respond, are reactive to it, and we get angry and unhappy. And okay, fine, but we don't. This has a boomerang effect. Those things are only happening to me because I've created the causes for them to happen in that way. Those are just sound waves coming at me. And the feeling component comes up because a lot of your karma ripens in the feeling component. So I have an unpleasant experience. But, somebody else could hear those words and they could have a neutral experience. And even I could have a neutral experience, and I do sometimes. Or I might even have a pleasant experience. Who knows? Anything's possible. It's not hardwired that these sound waves come at me and I have to have the feeling component is going to come up. You can't control that part. But when it comes up, you don't have to buy into it. So yeah, I might have an unpleasantness come up, but if I can really penetrate these teachings, then it can end right there. That's what's possible. And there's a lot of ways to make that happen, and this is one of them. One of them is to realize the reason I'm experiencing that way in this moment has nothing to do with the person who said those words. It's just a ripening of my previous karma, because that's where it ripens, in the feeling component. And so I'm having the experience of an unpleasant feeling. From there, you can't stop that part of it, by the way. I researched that out years ago. The feeling component is there. This is where most of our karma ripens. But then after that, everything else happens. You kind of start dwelling on it and inappropriate attention, and then you get yourself all worked up. That is all what you don't need to do. That's voluntary. That's something we have. That's where our Dharma practice comes in. So one way to work with this is to realize and to regard unpleasant situations as a result of our own negative karma. And this is really personal to me, because I had a close friend for many years, and she said something to me once that just always stuck with me, and I even thought about it today, and my response to it I thought about too. And it's she said, you always seem to be around angry people. And for years that just kind of haunted me, because it was true. My first memory is basically of seeing things that were involving anger. And we're always around angry people. But I latched onto that and had kind of a feeling of shame. And what I think well, that's crazy. Everyone has afflictions. You're always going to be around people who have everything going on. I bought into that because she was a close friend of mine, and I really thought about it, but I didn't think about it right until I had the Dharma tools. And it's yeah, and I've created the causes of this. So instead of letting my mind kind of sink, if I can apply this verse, I can say, well, great. This is a moment. This is what's so great about the aspiration to be a bodhisattva. This is a moment where I can let this karma end, and it's done. And to be able to start believing that is really powerful, because then you'll have energy and the exertion to act differently and not like let your mind go down like what we did in the earlier verses. See what the effect on your mind is to dwell in these afflictions and let them fester and grow and hang out with them. The effect on your mind is horrible. So if you want to do something different, you need to have different ways to think about these things. And I could say, to tell you the truth, whether it's true or not, I don't even care at this point. I really don't care. I care about the moment of what I'm doing. Like, I don't know if there's previous lives. I do things to help myself believe that because it's convenient. It's useful, because these ways of working with things are useful. This is the lojong part of it, the thought training part. And so if I can take these situations and analyze them in this way and have it end right there, my day's a lot better. Just right that. And if I can just expand my mind, I can say, I'm ending this and I'm creating really a lot of virtue, and I'm going to develop my fortitude, and then I'll have a much easier time having joyous effort, which is fun, and I would like to do that. And I might even expand myself to doing these with a motivation beyond this life, this day. I might think about the next life, or maybe, being liberated from this whole show, So, I work where I'm at. I start with the day. I want to have a good day. Oh, and I want to have a good life. But I can kind of go beyond that. I don't have to stay with that. That's just so, what? That's not Dharma practice yet. That's the 8 worldly concerns. You haven't really reached the level of practicing the Dharma if you're only thinking about this life. It kind of comes down to that. So, even though that's what I think about all the time is this life, this day, because of course our attachment wants us to be comfortable. Every moment we want to be comfortable, but we don't have to live our lives that way. We can go beyond that. So,
also too, Venerable Tarka, that this is a powerful antidote to reacting and causing karma, because to believe that harsh speech is negative karma arising, some part of your mind has got to have some sort of faith and trust that has something to do about rebirth.
Right.
It's coming from the past, So for me, this is helpful that if it's happening now, the logic assumption is what I'm going to be doing now is going to affect something in the future. Right,
because what's happening is this is where we had a really good question from somebody. I don't think I left this in here. I think I might have cut it out, but in the transcript, I can't remember his name, the fellow from Seattle asked this question about purification. It was such a great question. It's probably even in these notes, but we don't have time. But he basically was saying, well, is it when you purify, because Venerable kind of explained this, is it just like, like, I'm sorry I did this kind of thing, I can't remember what it was, but is it just that simple? Isn't there a little bit more to it? And then it got into this discussion about, well, yeah, if you get into this deeply, you can see that you're ending your karma there, and you can recognize that in this moment I'm able to create a lot of merit, and man, that's great, because then I'm going to propel myself forward in a different way, and I'm going to cut these things off. It's like you're taking this bank of negativities and you're just like tossing them out, and they're never going to return. Whereas if you don't do that, if you react with anger, and you just perpetuate the whole thing, then you're doing like the worst of the worst. Because, when you look at the kinds of karma, the results of karma, the 4 results of karma, 3 of them are neutral. We don't think of them as neutral because being born in a hell realm or being born in painful situations doesn't feel so neutral. But it's actually ethically neutral. There's nothing virtuous or non-virtuous about being born with a deformity. It just is. It might be a suffering, but it's not virtuous or non-virtuous. The only result of karma that isn't neutral is this one of this habitual tendencies that we create. We create the habit to do these things. So when you keep responding with anger, you're just creating the habit to do that, which is going to lead to more suffering, because because it leads you to more negative. You're getting an unwholesome, how do you say that properly? Your result there is not neutral, because you're creating this tendency, you're going to repeat these things. So that's, when you look at it that way, it's like, God, that's a real big disadvantage. That's the great thing about the Dharma that really works for our minds. Look at the advantages and the disadvantages. Which do you want to do? Do you want to end it here, or do you want to keep going? You know, do you want to continue being miserable, or do you want to just end it here and have a way to feel really good about yourself? Because developing fortitude is not easy, but it's so powerful, and we can see that from the people we're around. You know, I mean, Venerable has huge amounts of fortitude, and then you look at his holiness. I mean, how could he have the mind he has, that he sees everyone? You know, he can do this bodhicitta thing because he can hold that kind of metta for people, that kind of love for people, because he comes from a place of equanimity to start with. And, you know, we're still struggling with having our minds be equanimous enough to be able to do the meditations, you know. So, anyway. Okay, we'll go to the very last thing, because all these sections, chapters end with a stanza. I'll just read the stanza, a summarizing stanza. Transmigrators, that's people who are cycling again and again in cyclic existence, governed by afflictions like desire, which prevent activities for the attainment of awakening, are conveyed to the happiness of liberation by teaching them to become familiar with love and repulsiveness, by teaching them suchness. So basically in this verse, the main thrust of this chapter was teaching people the antidotes to anger, which is love, the antidotes to desire, which is repulsiveness, and the antidotes to confusion, which is teaching about suchness. So basically, by understanding how to get rid of these disturbing, these afflictions or disturbing emotions, we can make the causes to free ourselves completely from cyclic existence. And then we can think about others and have the basis to generate a genuine compassion, because without understanding your own situation of the kind of unsatisfactory nature of cyclic existence and these kinds of dukkha, you can't really have genuine compassion for others. It will just be a surface level thing. So yeah, a few dedication prayers, and send this out to any beings right now who are struggling in any way to have a little light ray of merit that will help them to have more space in their minds.